Welcome to the analysis. I'm Barry Stevens. I'm joined today by international law expert Michael Byers, and we're going to be talking about outer space. Don't forget to subscribe on YouTube or on the theAnalysis.news website, where if you like this kind of content, you can also contribute. I'll see you in a moment. The exploration and use of outer space shall be carried out for the benefit and in the interests of all countries, and shall be the province of all mankind. Now, that's Article 1 of the Outer Space Treaty, signed in 1967. So, at the height of the Cold War, Communist Soviet Union and capitalist United States managed to agree that space belongs to everyone in peace. Well, maybe not anymore, because behind the breathless media coverage of astronauts circling the moon and rockets landing by themselves is the militarization of space, especially by the USA, which is looking, of course, to build what they call a golden dome to protect its homeland. Rival moon bases are planned by both China and the United States. Meanwhile, a single company, Elon Musk's, is looking to have 70,000 satellites in orbit. Space is getting crowded with very little traffic management. Uh, Basically, no one's in charge. So my guest today is Michael Byers, who is Canada Research Chair in Global Politics and International Law at the University of British Columbia and co-author of Who Owns Outer Space, which I would recommend. I just finished it last night. So, Michael, what worries you most about what's happening in space right now?
What is the worst thing happening in space? I have a choice of different bad things that I could talk about in my response. Um, but I want to start by saying it's not all bad. So, for instance, Earth imaging satellites in low Earth orbit have enabled humanity to dramatically expand food production over the last half century by monitoring moisture levels, insect infestations, things like that. Space has certain utility to it, but you're right. There are some dynamics underway that threaten our continued peaceful access to space. And we're also in a situation where a tragedy of the commons is emerging in low Earth orbit because of the exponential rise in the number of human-made objects there. So what's the worst thing? I would have to say that it's the adoption of the language that outer space is a quote warfighting domain.
Mm,
And that language was first articulated by Donald Trump during his first term as president when he announced the creation of the US Space Force. And as you mentioned when you quoted Article 1 of the Outer Space Treaty, um, humanity has been in agreement since the 1960s that space should be a peaceful domain. And indeed, the 1967 Outer Space Treaty can be seen as an arms control agreement. It prohibits the deployment of nuclear weapons in space. It talks about peaceful use. It was essentially the Soviet Union and the United States coming together to draw a border around their geopolitical and military competition on Earth and saying that space would be different, that the Cold War would not extend there. And Donald Trump, as he has done on so many other things, has ripped up this decades-long consensus, adopted the language of warfighting domain, poured tens, hundreds of billions of dollars into the militarization of space, including for Golden Dome, which in its most expansive plan includes missile interceptors based in low Earth orbit. And when you start talking about a domain like space as a warfighting domain, that almost becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. How would you expect the Chinese government to respond to that kind of language and that kind of spending? Well, to invest more in the Chinese militarization of space. And you can very quickly get an escalatory cycle where, again, up until 10 years ago, space was peaceful. It was reserved mostly for civilian functions. And insofar as it was used for military functions, those functions were simply to support military operations on the surface of the planet. So facilitating communication, using Earth imagery for surveillance purposes. But
GPS, for instance, was I guess, as a
G,
military.
G, GPS was the global positioning system is owned by the U.S. military, but the decision was made to open up those signals to anyone to support and promote the terrestrial economy and also things like civilian navigation and search and rescue. And I guess my point here is that there's been a character change in how the world thinks about space as a result of Donald Trump. And I worry that this peaceful domain where no country has ever struck another country's satellite with a physical object, no one has ever shot down someone else's satellite with a ground-based missile. That more than half century of restraint could now be crumbling as a result of Donald Trump reframing the situation and choosing to weaponize it.
Yeah, I think that in that, if I'm not mistaken, that executive order where he launched Space Force as a semi-independent branch of the services, didn't he also explicitly say that space was not a global commons? Am I wrong about that?
So the first Trump administration explicitly denied that space was a global commons. It just so happened that the executive director of the Space Advisory Council set up under Donald Trump, a man named Scott Pace, who I like and respect, had a bit of a bugbear with the term global commons. So he took a pot shot in it when writing the executive order. But that's not so important. Space is is prohibited from becoming subject to national appropriation. You can't claim sovereignty of orbits or of the moon or of asteroids. That's explicitly prohibited. And there's a freedom of exploration and use that's set out explicitly at the front end of the Outer Space Treaty. So
And
the
rescue, right? I mean, and there's an
Yeah.
obligation to help each other in space as well as just not attack each other.
Yeah, and a lot of these rules still work very well today. But my point is that reframing uh, the domain as a war-fighting domain instead of a domain of peace and cooperation has shifted the mindset of other countries also. And
Mm.
China doesn't want to get into an arms race with the United States in space. China is fully integrated into the global economy. It's the world's largest trading state. It doesn't stand to benefit from provoking conflict with Western countries, and it certainly doesn't want to do that in space. But it's being dragged into it by the rhetoric and the actions of Donald J. Trump, and that's a
Mm.
cause of great concern. It's very destabilizing.
It may be just Donald J. Trump, but one sees a tremendous number of people and institutions, including Space Force, of course, jumping on board and private industry. But just to what you were saying about, this new direction, I'm reminded of, and was reminded in your book, of the ISS. There was also a moment when I think Apollo and Soyuz had a kind of a meeting in space. But the International Space Station was this pretty extraordinary co-production of several countries, but especially the Soviet Union and the United States, or Russia and the United States. And that was remarkable, I thought.
And and it continues to this day. So, when I talk about Donald Trump, I have to be clear that there are people in the U.S. space system, including NASA, that recognize the value of having cooperative mechanisms like
Mm.
the International Space Station. So in the last couple of years, after the Russian full-scale invasion of Ukraine and a serious breakdown in Russian NATO relations, um, American astronauts, several of them, have launched the International Space Station on Russian Soyuz rockets from the Russian Cosmodrome in Kazakhstan. And several Russian cosmonauts have launched from Cape Canaveral on SpaceX Falcon 9 rockets to the International Space Station. And neither NASA nor the Russian Space Agency, Roscosmos, had to do this. They're perfectly capable of launching their own people. They did the switch simply to demonstrate to the world that they're still cooperating with each other. And
Mm.
I'm not sure whether Donald Trump has been aware of this or not, but the point is that some cooperation continues. Now, to give you another example, there's an international organization based in Montreal called Cospis Sarsat that was created in 1979 by the USSR, the United States, Canada, and France uh, to pool their satellites for the purposes of receiving emergency signals from search and rescue beacons on Earth's surface. This system has saved tens of thousands of lives since the 1980s.
R-
It's
Right.
still functioning today. Russian satellites, Chinese satellites, American satellites, Canadian satellites, we're all in this together. We're using the satellites to save lives, and the beacons themselves are now mandatory on every aircraft and every boat or ship above a certain size. So it's part of the international safety system for aviation and for navigation. It started in 1979, and it's the international organization, a small international organization, but it's the international organization that no one has ever heard of because it works so well.
But on the other hand, I just read the acting NASA administrator, I don't remember the name, recently said the goal is to beat China to the moon, not just to leave footprints, but this time to stay. Well, that's not particularly aggressive. But on the other hand, you have the Artemis Accords, and maybe you could talk about that, because when I was reading about the Artemis Accords, which are kind of an agreement between the United States and its allies, including Canada, to have their own set of rules, which seem, and I believe Russia and China were not happy about that. And it does seem to be sort of, is it making an end run around the Outer Space Treaty?
On the American program concerning the moon, um, when Barack Obama became president, he wanted the United States to go farther, to do something new, and he announced that Mars was the goal for human space flight for NASA. And at the same time, a brash young entrepreneur named Elon Musk uh, got seriously into space, very successfully into space, with the explicit goal of taking human beings to Mars. And so it was all about Mars until Donald Trump became president in his first term and rejected everything that Barack Obama had done. And so it couldn't be Mars anymore. It had to be back to the moon. And the moon had the additional attraction that it was at least plausible that Americans could return to the moon while Donald Trump was still president. And
Right.
so the whole obsession with the moon is driven by Donald Trump's insecurity vis-a-vis Barack Obama and his successes. And of course the media loves astronauts, it loves rockets. The moon is baked into our collective self-conscious as a result of the Mercury and Gemini and Apollo programs back in the 50s and 60s. So everyone has got on board with the moon, but realistically, I mean, the moon is a waste of time. It's got very little water. It's got very little in the way of natural resources. It's covered with tiny particles of razor sharp dust. It's only got 1/6 Earth gravity. It's not an attractive location. Whereas Mars is much more interesting. Mars is 1/3 Earth gravity. Mars used to be a watery planet. There's still lots and lots of water frozen into the permafrost and under the poles. There's even, quite possibly evidence of ancient life forms, microscopic life forms on
But
Mars. And so when I look at the whole Artemis program and astronauts flying around the moon, I feel like I'm in a time warp. I feel like I'm back in the 1960s. I'm almost expecting JFK to pop up on the television screen.
mm,
And so I have trouble taking this seriously, apart from the fact that, yeah, governments are spending hundreds of billions of dollars trying to do this, and they're seeking to justify it as a race with China, which is basically where the United States was during the 1960s, trying to develop its space capabilities, looking at the moon as an easy first step, waving the flag. But again, they're chasing an object, the moon, that really isn't that valuable.
it's very interesting. I'm not quite sure why we need to go to Mars, except for scientific the curiosity, which is great, of course. But the
Hmm.
way Elon Musk frames it is sort of like Earth 2. Once this place goes to shit, well, we'll go to another planet, which of course is offensive to anyone who cares about this planet being dealing with its major crises, especially, of course, climate change.
Yeah, well, let's be clear. There is no planet B, right? I mean, um, Earth is a uniquely hospitable location for life, and we have evolved specifically for this planet and the conditions here. Mars is really hard. I mean, you step outside without a spacesuit, you're dead. If you don't have a air conditioning system in your habitation, you're dead. If there's a major solar storm and you haven't tunneled underneath the surface of the planet, you're dead from radiation. The list goes on, right?
Mm,
So in order to have, any human beings on Mars for any length of time would cost, quite literally trillions of dollars. It's not an economically feasible option. But I should say, and you mentioned it, the scientific attractions of Mars are enormous. Imagine if we were to retrieve the samples that have been collected on Mars by NASA's Perseverance rover over the last few years. If we were able to bring them back to Earth robotically and study them here and were to get 100% confirmation that life had existed on Mars. That arguably would be the greatest scientific discovery in human history.
mm,
Donald Trump has
mm,
canceled that sample return mission, right?
I didn't know that actually.
He wants to build Golden Dome at a cost of $1 trillion. And to help pay for that, or because he's not interested in science, or because he doesn't want something from Mars that could challenge organized religion, he's canceled that sample return mission and thus denied us the opportunity to learn something potentially quite profound about the origins of life, about our place in the universe. So, yeah, Mars
Mm,
is primarily a science destination. That's also why,
mm,
the big space companies aren't interested in Mars because there's not much to do there except science. Whereas if you,
mm,
if you go to the moon, well, then there's this race with China, and you're going to be, trying to uh, develop some mining of helium-3, which is going to be preposterously expensive, and the opportunities to 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 collect around the massive government trough of funding for a space race for a competitive
mm,
situation are very attractive for not just the SpaceXs of the world, but the Lockheed Martins, the Palantirs. I mean, they're all in it. And yeah, ultimately, it's just another way of taking money out of the taxpayer pocket. Whereas Mars doesn't cost as much and is about something useful, something interesting. It's about advancing our
mm.
knowledge. And that's where the divide really comes down. It's between money making versus learning more about the universe.
Well, let's talk about the Golden Dome. A colleague of mine, the editor of this channel, actually likes to say that it's more about the gold than the dome. But as you were saying, it's a trough. But uh, and space, for all this high-flown talk about peace, is of course has always been involved with the military, right from the V-2 rockets fired by the Nazis onto London and right up to now. So the Golden Dome is the idea is to protect the United States with a shield like Israel's Iron Dome system, um, and um, and protect it from nuclear weapons being fired from China, Russia, North Korea, wherever. The problem, the critics say, is that hitting a bullet with a bullet is always going to be more expensive than just firing a bullet. Um, the offense can always saturate the defense at a fraction of the cost. So is there any technical feasibility to this? Has that cost exchange ratio changed at all, or are they just spending $1 trillion to learn the same lesson that Reagan learned 40 years ago?
I'm careful to never say never. Technology, especially space technology, has been developing at an enormous rate. Um, and Elon Musk's pioneering of reusable rockets has, changed some of the cost equations in pretty fundamental ways. But you're absolutely right that it, it's difficult to imagine a space-based missile interceptor system that first of all would work, and secondly would be in any way protected against attack on that space-based system. So to give you just one specific example, in response to Ronald Reagan's Strategic Defense Initiative, the so-called Star Wars, which included the idea of placing interceptors in space, so-called bright pebbles. Some Soviet scientists came up with an attack system, which they published about, called the pellet ring. And with one large rocket, a proton rocket, they could launch 500,000 tiny, 3 millimeter steel pellets into a curtain across the orbital plane of all of these missile interceptors, and essentially have a curtain of shotgun pellets, just knocking these missile interceptor satellites out one by one, not by blowing them up, but by penetrating the machine and destroying the electronics. Um, and I haven't heard any astrophysicist explain why this wouldn't work. It would work, and so for the price of 500,000 steel pellets and a single rocket, this entire Golden Dome space-based system could be rendered inert. And of course, people who are selling a product don't want to tell you about the potential problems with the product. They want to tell you about how amazing it's going to be, how this is going to be the best thing ever, why you should give them money and acquire this product. And so, discussions about the vulnerability of Golden Dome. So it's not just, could it work if you throw enough money at it, but could you actually protect it against attack? And of course, if you're not interested in that, if your goal is simply to get massive government contracts to develop technologies to launch satellites, well, it's this isn't about the end goal. This is about the voyage and the massive profits that will be accumulated along the way. And this is happening
Mm.
at a time when, you've seen the Trump administration and Elon Musk, when he had his Department of Government Efficiency, cutting USAID, right, the U.S. International Development Program, at the cost already of several million lives in sub-Saharan Africa. I mean, this is the other irony of all this, is that there's this explosion in military spending on what looks like sci-fi to the profit of these massive corporations at the same time that the same government and the same people are making choices that are killing millions of vulnerable people here on Earth. So yeah,
Mm.
you can get really angry about it, and I try not to. My job is not to take on the whole system. My job is to say, have you thought about risk? Have you thought about vulnerabilities? Can we identify why cooperation might work better than conflict in this particular domain? And part of this is in the hope that whoever follows, Donald J. Trump, might actually be interested in expert advice and be interested in rational decision making. I mean, right now it's pretty chaotic. There's not a lot of room for policy advice. But I want to do more than just shout into the void.
The Golden Dome and indeed Star Wars were in in violation of the old anti-ballistic missile treaty. And I just want to ask for your comment about that, being an international law expert. That seemed to me to be the cornerstone and a very important part of cooperation, as you said, arms control. The idea being that since you can always find ways to evade a defense, a missile defense, that whether it's pebbles or missiles coming over the South Pole or any number of other things that Russia is coming up with, that your vulnerability is in a sense your best security in this nightmare of nuclear weapons. And so the ABM treaty was the two sides agreeing not to put up a defense, which could be overwhelmed, and create an arms race, which could be very, very dangerous. But that was thrown out uh, 25 years ago, I guess, by George W. Bush. I just wondered if you comment on the ABM.
Well, the NBM treaty was part of a package of arms control treaties between the United States and the Soviet Union, and you're absolutely right. Its goal was to preserve mutually assured destruction, to to ensure that no country would be protected from retaliation in the event that they launched a first nuclear strike.
And you
Um,
can see where that's attractive too. I mean, you can see why
oh,
Reagan thought, wait a minute, I don't like mutually assured destruction. It is an attractive
I
idea to be protected.
I don't like mutually assured destruction, but it may be the reason why you and I are here, right? We avoided a nuclear war between the Soviet Union and the United States, in part because of those arms control treaties, in part because of submarine launched intercontinental ballistic missiles, which are the second strike. They are. They operate, deep under the ocean or under the ice cap at in the Arctic to precisely survive a first strike, and be able to deliver that response. I don't like that, but arguably it worked. And the George W. Bush administration was riding high on the not just the end of the Cold War, but the economic collapse of Russia, the diminishment of Russian military power. They had their own logic. Unlike the current administration, people like Donald Rumsfeld and Dick Cheney had a logic, not one I agreed with,
Mm.
um, but they made that decision. They invested in ballistic missile defense, directed at least in the first instance at North Korea. Some of their allies, including Canada, thought it was a bad idea and refused to join. And it turned out, not to be as effective as they'd hoped. But fortunately, it's never needed to be used in anger, right?
Mm.
Some kind of balance still was maintained because ballistic missile defense could never deal with the thousands of missiles held by Russia, the hundreds of missiles held by China, and and missiles carrying multiple warheads. So you couldn't deal with the numbers involved. But the Trump administration seems to be influenced by these 1990, 2000 fantasies, or the earlier ones from the Reagan administration, and has embarked on the same horrendously expensive folly. And it's
Mm,
destabilizing, first and foremost. Even if it doesn't work, it's destabilizing,
mm.
right?
Yeah, you could say that um, it's extremely dangerous if it doesn't work. It's also extremely dangerous if it does work, which may be more dangerous.
Yeah, it's unlikely to work. So the my concern is destabilization during the construction, during the and all the rhetoric associated with it. And I have no sympathy for the Chinese regime or the Russian regime. They are those governments do horrible things, including committing genocide. But I do try to understand how they might see these developments in the United States. And Golden Dome cannot help but create some paranoia in Beijing and Moscow. And paranoia is a recipe for escalation and should be avoided if we can.
And the motivation, of course, is one, you want to stop it before it becomes operational. Because if it did work and it became operational, then the United States would have a total defense and could go on the offense. So if you were on the other side of that, disregarding, as you say, the moral qualities of the regimes, you would want to attack and destroy it before it became operational. That's what I would
And,
think.
and even then, you're living in a fantasy world because a large-scale nuclear attack is going to spread radiation around the planet, right? I mean,
Or use the
we
pebbles. But if you
yeah,
use the pebbles, you're aren't you also destroying your own satellites? Or in fact, it has been bruited around that you could use a nuclear weapon to destroy the Golden Dome. I mean, you could. I don't mean on the surface, but way up high,
yeah.
where you'd create, I think, just a flash of radiation, which would destroy
Mhm.
all your own satellites too. But isn't hasn't
Yeah,
that been discussed?
it has been discussed, and there was a lot of media reporting a couple of years ago about a potential Russian nuclear weapon launched on a satellite. The more credible reports suggest that there wasn't actually a weapon launched, but that Russia has a program that's developing the idea of a space-based nuclear weapon. Of course, militaries have thousands of programs. Whether they actually are fulfilled is another question. But I just want to emphasize here that it's important we don't get sucked into this fantasy game that military planners and pro-military think tanks are playing in our intellectual space, on the internet, in the mainstream media. A lot of this stuff is just money grubbing by big companies and gullible politicians who want to look tough and want to have a foil in an aggressive China, for instance. No country has ever attacked another country's satellite, right?
Mm,
So we've
mm,
had a de facto arms control regime in space for all weapons since the
mm,
1950s. And I'm an international lawyer, but quite frankly, you can have norms of behavior outside of treaties. And sometimes those norms can be just as effective in terms of restraining state action. And I
right.
think this is an instance where we've had a norm of non-weaponization that has held very well for a long, long time. And
Mm,
that's what Donald Trump is now upending. We haven't done joint missions with the Chinese because of the stupidity of Republicans in Congress who banned NASA from cooperating with the Chinese Space Agency. That hasn't stopped all cooperation. NASA periodically gets waivers from that restriction so they can do specific projects with the Chinese. But I think it was an opportunity missed. I think Chinese astronauts should have been welcome on the International Space Station. That was the whole purpose of the International Space
Mm,
Station. It was
mm.
partly about supporting science, but it was mostly about creating more international cooperation. Um, and
Well, let's,
you know, it's
sorry.
not too late. Let me just say this. It's not too late.
So, what can we do to get back to a spirit of cooperation and pulling away from this military confrontation?
Well, let me give you one specific example. Astronomers are very concerned about preserving the so-called radio quiet zone that exists on the far side of the moon. So we human beings produce an awful lot of noise on our planet. Not just noise that we can hear, but noise we can't hear in terms of all kinds of transmissions. Just our global cell phone network alone, we are a really noisy place. And if you are a radio astronomer, so the kind of astronomy that uses radio waves to probe deep into the universe, you need a radio quiet zone. So, we build radio telescopes in deserts in South Africa. We try to get away from all the noise. But the best place in terms of there being no noise is the far side of the moon because the moon acts as a big shield.
Mm,
And so the dream of radio astronomers is to build radio telescopes on the far side of the moon. And radio telescopes are interesting because the bigger they are, the better they are generally. This is big infrastructure, or you need
mm.
multiple nodes. There's even one radio telescope under construction right now that has nodes both in South Africa and Australia to get the maximum sort of triangulation of coverage. So the idea is, well, why don't Western countries partner with China to, first of all, protect the radio quiet zone, but then to construct facilities that are coordinated to work together to essentially create a massive multilateral radio telescope capability on the far side of the moon. It would only be for science. It would be challenging and expensive. This is not something that one country could do on its own, or at least do well on its own. Um, and it's feasible because the moon really isn't that far away. And this wouldn't involve putting boots on the ground. This could all be done robotically. And the Chinese are really good at moon landing with robotics. They actually returned a sample of lunar soil from the far side of the moon a few years ago. There's been a little bit of cooperation already. That lunar soil retrieval mission that the Chinese ran had an instrument from the European Space Agency on board. So this is to my mind, the positive opportunity. And you don't need to stop all the militarization stuff in order to cooperate on a certain thing. We did the handshake in space at the same time that the United States and Soviet Union were building thousands of ICBMs, right? You can walk and chew gum at the same time, but
Right.
you need to be chewing some gum, right? You can't just
Or,
be walking
well,
or the other way around, right?
I think it's the other way around. Yes.
Yeah, yeah, but my point here is that there are opportunities for cooperation, and they're focused on science, and science
I
is
understand.
so that's where I would want to go. And I'd also, obviously want to get rid of the rhetoric about the warfighting domain and, get realistic about Golden Dome. Space-based interceptors are not a viable component of any such system. Start to dial back some of those things, and dialing back on some of those things might well will almost certainly take a new administration in Washington, but we can
Mm,
prepare the ground now. And so again, I come back to my point. It's easy to just shout at the Trump administration and say, look, this is all bad. And I do that, right? But I also want to be putting forward positive ideas that the next administration or current governments in other countries could take up to create some positive elements within what is a pretty dark space.
Thank you. That's great. Thanks to Michael Byers, my guest. We're going to take a break here and we're going to continue this conversation in a second part on theanalysis.news and on YouTube. So please watch out for that. And please don't forget to like and subscribe. And if you feel inclined on theanalysis.news to contribute if you like this kind of content. See you next time.